A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first session of Climate Governance Malaysia's Directors Conversation Series 2025. I'm Gary Theseira, and it's my pleasure to open today's session, which is entitled Nature, Risk and Responsibility, a TNFD deep dive for decision makers. Building on the success of our 2024 Masterclass series and held in conjunction with the 2025 edition, the Directors Conversations Series 2025 serves as a dynamic platform for corporate leaders to engage directly with global experts and peers. What these sessions provide is some timely insights into emerging trends, regulatory developments, and actionable strategies driving corporate climate ambition. We would like to extend our sincere appreciation to the Securities Commission and Chair Dato' Faiz, Malaysia for hosting us, and also the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures for the support in making this session possible. Before we begin, we would like to invite you to share your initial thoughts before the session. There is a QR code that we're going to flash up on the screen in a minute. No, I think you're lower. I think you're below it. Yeah, I think they've got a good angle. Yeah, thank you. That's the problem with low screens. So you will find in this QR code, you'll find a questionnaire that actually takes you through before and after. All right, so just leave that page open when you get to that question. And then after, you can just continue on the same questionnaire and complete that. So you don't have to do two separate questionnaires, one before and one after. All right, so it's now my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker this morning, Mr. Tony Goldner, the Chief Executive Officer of the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD. With over 2 decades of experience advising governments, financial institutions, and philanthropic leaders, Mr. Goldner has been at the forefront of shaping strategies at the nexus of business, finance, and public policy. His work spans center of government reform, national economic development, and pioneering green initiatives. Mr. Goldner began his career in the Australian diplomatic service before moving into investment banking, where he specialized in infrastructure project financing. He later became a strategy consulting partner at Monitor Deloitte, and also served as an advisor to the World Bank Group. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Tony Goldner. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I just realized it's been about 25 years since I was in Kuala Lumpur, so I'm looking forward to spending the weekend here and seeing how much Malaysia has changed since I was last here. I'm really excited to hear is that better? Yeah, really excited to hear the conversation that we have this morning. I just spent 4 days at Ecosperity Week in Singapore, and a terrific level of conversation in Singapore. In fact, I met a number of Malaysians there as well. And I think nature is really rising up the agenda, and that's important and it's encouraging. And that's despite all of the geopolitical noise and the other issues around cost of living and trade wars now and various other things. So overall, I'm very encouraged about the momentum around this issue. Obviously, people in business and finance are overwhelmed with many tasks and responsibilities, many competing priorities. It's hard enough to run a successful business these days, let alone with all of the additional risk burdens being thrown at business, whether it's cyber risk or supply chain resilience or climate and nature issues. But we do have to find the headspace to address these issues because they're not going to go away. And as the former central bank governor of the Bank of Singapore has said, Ravi Menon, just a few weeks ago, at the end of the day, nature is going to call the shots. We often forget that we We exist, our businesses, our economy and our society sit on top of the natural world. We depend 100% on the natural world. We can't pretend to divorce ourselves from these issues because at the end of the day, the planetary boundaries are going to be the thing that defines our long-term success. So what I wanted to do today was give you a bit of an update on TNFD. I wanted to frame why we think this is so important and why amongst all of these other competing priorities is it so important for Malaysian business and financial institutions to continue to move forward on this topic. I'm also very encouraged, and I did want to acknowledge that we've had some terrific engagement from Malaysian companies before, and also a special call out to the central bank team here. Amongst the network of central banks around the world, your central bank is doing some very interesting work on nature risk and macroprudential stability. I had the chance to meet with members of the team in Colombia at the Nature COP last year, COP16, and we remain in touch with them and very keen to learn about their research and their thinking here in Kuala Lumpur. So it's terrific to see leadership from here amongst the central banks around the world. So I think the place to start is we ultimately have to shift our mindset. We can get into all the technical details about standards and ISSB and corporate reporting, but all of that will be necessary. But to really underpin the resilience of business going forward, it starts with changing the mindset about how we think about business's relationship to nature. And so I wanted to just frame this conversation with a few provocations for you, because over the last 20 years, we've all been very focused on dealing with this topic of climate change. It really all started with something called the Stern Report, issued out of the United Kingdom in about 2004, 2005. Following that, we had the Paris Agreement, then we had TCFD, and we've had a huge amount of investment by, no doubt, everyone in this room and around the world in understanding how to respond to the challenge of climate change. I'm sure if we were here 10 years ago and I asked you, how many people know what Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions are, a lot of people maybe never heard of those terms before, right? So we have developed what I call a climate brain. We've developed a way of thinking about these issues and an analytical framework, a carbon budget, emission scopes, mitigation and adaptation as two different concepts. We now need to do the same for the rest of nature. And we can't pretend to think that if we just deal with climate change as one isolated issue, we're going to live in a more sustainable planet. Because, of course, the planet itself is full of these very complex relationships between land, ocean, freshwater, atmosphere. It's all connected, right? And because humans like to break things into buckets to understand complex problems, we've set about tackling one problem, and now we have to quickly now address the other related issues. So I would argue, and I wanted to start with this provocation this morning, and I welcome your thoughts, but I would suggest we need to start thinking about nature. This is not a compliance issue. There is a compliant aspect to this issue, but this is a strategic risk management issue. Nor is this corporate social responsibility. This is not about conserving a little bit of land or having your staff participate in a cleanup day. We have to start thinking about nature as a strategic risk and opportunity management issue at the heart of a company's strategy and at the heart of the financial system. We have to move from our carbon budget brain, because we all share one atmosphere. We can calculate the ability of the atmosphere to tolerate emissions. So we have this fixed budget, and it's essentially an allocation issue. With the rest of nature, as we know, it's local, and nature has this remarkable ability to regenerate itself. So in a sense, it's limitless. If we manage it in the right way, nature will restore itself and underpin our own resilience. So we have to go from a carbon budget mindset to working within planetary boundaries and thinking about our relationship with the natural system in terms of resilience, because the resilience of business sits on top of the resilience of nature. If we degrade nature's ability to provide what the scientists call ecosystem services into our businesses, we won't have the water that we need in our production facilities. We won't have pollination services to pollinate the crops and the plants that we need, right? So thinking about the resilience of business and the resilience of nature is a really powerful framing for how to mobilize business and financial action. that implicitly means we're switching from thinking about nature as an externality that we don't have to worry about to bring it into the center of corporate strategy, right? And I would suggest one way to think about that is to think about investing in the resilience of nature the way we invest in infrastructure. So all around the world, countries have been building toll roads and airports and things to improve the productivity of their economy. If we invest in the resilience of nature, we're investing in the productivity of the economy, just in a different way. And that all suggests that we have to move from one-dimensional solutions to three-dimensional solutions, right? So we've seen around the world a lot of people investing in carbon forestry, and the incentive has been to plant trees that grow really fast and generate as much carbon as you can. But you end up leaving a complete desert underneath those trees. It does nothing for the rest of nature, or very little for the rest of nature. And so it doesn't contribute to nature, and in many cases it's not good for the local surrounding communities. So we have to move from solving for one problem, carbon, to solving for three problems, which is carbon, nature, and social considerations, right? And that's a challenge, but it's also a tremendous opportunity. And Mark Carney, who was the champion of the TCFD, has described the nature problem as potentially the biggest opportunity since the Industrial Revolution. Not just decarbonisation, but everything to do with rebalancing our relationship with nature. So it's worth reminding in this context that in the science, climate change is one of the 5 drivers of change. Right? There are these other 4 drivers, and TNFD was really created to say, well, we've made a lot of progress on climate change. We have the Paris Agreement, we have TCFD, but what about the other 4? So that was the rationale for the creation of TNFD, and we have really picked up and focused on those other 4 drivers. The other way to look at it is through the planetary boundaries lens, and hopefully you're all familiar with this science from the Stockholm Resilience Centre. Again, climate change is one of the 9 boundaries. And I was at a conference recently in Switzerland, and the alarming news was we may now be about to cross the 7th threshold this year or next year, right? So the question is, we've got to widen the aperture out from thinking about climate change and emissions and adaptation and mitigation, and we have to start looking at how do we respond to all of these issues in an integrated way. That's going to be challenging, but it's also a tremendous opportunity. So at TNFD, no doubt on the climate side, you'll all be familiar with physical risk and transition risk. The other risk that we have introduced into the lexicon around nature is the notion of systemic risk. Now, typically, systemic risk is associated with central banks worrying about the systemic risk to a whole economy or to an entire financial system. In the nature context, we think it's important to also be thinking about the systemic risk of the collapse of an entire ecosystem. Right? So if a defined area, if it degrades to a certain point where we can't recover it, then the economy as a whole is exposed to the loss of that ecosystem. Right? So it's worth just thinking about how are these factors and these drivers relevant to the long-term financial prospects of your business, right? Because the future ability of a business to generate cash flows depends on the ability of nature to provide those ecosystem services into your business. So it's a really interesting relationship between cash flows and the flow of ecosystem services. And unfortunately, as you all know, investors want to see positive returns, and the science is telling us that nature's ability to continue to provide those ecosystem services is heading in the wrong direction. So we have a fundamental mismatch at the moment. What we're also seeing at TNFD is that investors are starting to really appreciate these issues. And so not surprisingly, they're mobilizing through initiatives like Nature Action 100 and the PRI Spring Initiative, and they're starting to ask more questions. And they're doing that because the evidence is becoming clearer, the data is being assembled, and so it's starting to shift the mindset of investors. So while we're all very focused on regulation and when will this be regulated, and of course we will follow government regulation, I would suggest to you that right now, the bigger driver around this agenda is changing investor perceptions and expectations. And that's moving ahead of regulation. Right? So I'll share with you in a minute. So this first report here, When the Bee Stings, I would encourage you to have a look at it. This is available on our website. And it's a series of specific case studies around companies that have had significant financial impact because they were not managing their nature-related issues. And this is one of the key graphics from that report, and it shows you the financial impact in US dollars on these companies because of a nature-related issue. Some of these are short-term issues, like, for example, a bushfire that destroyed the assets of the company and exposed them to litigation, which was the case of PG&E on the far right-hand side. That's a Californian electricity utility that was found responsible for the biggest bushfire in Californian history. Their share price fell over 90%. They went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The credit rating tanked. And now they have to spend billions of dollars trying to put their poles and wires underground to avoid the future exposure to other bushfires. In the case of the big red bubble, the Tesla, that was the impact on their share price because of the risk of regulatory action by the German courts, because their gigafactory in Berlin was found to have lowered the entire water table under the city of Berlin. So that's made it harder for them to access the water, but it's also impacted on everybody else and every other business in the same area who relies on that water supply. So you can see this is not conceptual, and this is not something that's going to happen in 5 years' time. This is happening now. And because investors are starting to see this, they're starting to ask more questions and seeking more information from the companies they provide capital to. Not just investors, but insurers and banks as well. Just to give you an example, this is the Norwegian Sovereign Fund. And I highlight this for a few reasons. Number one, because it demonstrates that you can already do climate and nature assessment and reporting combined, which is exactly what we are trying to encourage. We're not suggesting people do a separate TNFD nature report. We want to see climate and nature assessment and analysis, coming together. The second thing is, this is the biggest single institutional investor in the world, $1.6 trillion in assets under management. They invest in over 9,000 companies around the world, 1.5% on average of the world stock market. And last year they engaged over 500 companies of that 9,000 on climate and nature issues. So that's a huge amount of engagement. But that shows their efforts to understand climate and nature risk in their portfolio, right? And what we hear from universal asset owners is, because we're in every sector, in every asset class, and across all geographies, we can't diversify from nature risk. So for probably the last decade, we've been hearing from investors that they can decarbonize their portfolios. Lots of investors are trying to decarbonize, but you can't denature your portfolio, right? Every sector, everywhere is dependent on nature. So it's a really interesting challenge. And big institutional asset owners are now walking towards this problem because they can't walk away from it. So it's now coming through in reports like this. There's active engagement. They're asking more questions. They're seeking more information. And it's impacting on their investment decisions. So you can see here in 2024, Norges Bank divested from 10 companies where they weren't satisfied about their response to climate and nature issues, but it also reinvested in 8 companies where they were satisfied that this company is taking action. And so they've re-entered the capital stack of that particular business, right? So it works both directions. So what do we do about this? How do we take practical action? So I wanted to just give you a quick update on a few things before we open up for questions and comments. The first is around assessment. The second is around reporting and target setting and transition planning. The third is around transition planning, which is starting to come, so building on net zero. And then obviously different capital allocation decisions. So many of you will be interested in how our work is going to cascade into the reporting landscape. And the good news is that at a global level, looking at the macro picture, I would say 18 months ago, people were very confused about how this was all going to play out, right? Is it going to be the same? Is it going to be different? We're confused. The alphabet soup of all these acronyms. But I think it's fair to say that the landscape for action is looking very familiar to what you've all had to navigate on climate and climate-related reporting. So at the top, we have now very clear goals covering climate and nature. So climate on the left in blue, nature on the right in green. We have initiatives like ours. We are not a standard setter. Our job is to provide market-based recommendations and science-backed recommendations to inform the future evolution of standards and regulation. So TCFD, TNFD, SBTI, SBTN, you can see the parallels, right? So the architecture is the same. We are already now working with the IFRS and the ISSB, and they have publicly stated that they are drawing on the TNFD's work as they look at extending beyond S1 and S2 into nature. And in fact, a month ago today, I was in Frankfurt and we announced a deepening of our collaboration with the ISSB, and we're now working with them effectively on a week-to-week basis. So they have launched a project called BEES, Biodiversity, Ecosystem and Ecosystem Services. They're in the early research phase, and we are closely supporting their efforts as they try to figure out what will they do on nature beyond climate change, because of course climate is the S2 standard. Now, a lot of people think that ISSB hasn't done nature yet, so we just have to focus on climate. But if you look at the S1 standard, all sustainability issues that are material already need to be disclosed. So nature is already covered by S1, right? So any company in the world that has identifies a material nature-related issue should already be disclosing that issue to investors. So it's important to recognize nature is already covered by S1. So the only question is whether they will provide additional guidance, as with S2 for climate, on these other aspects of nature. And I suspect that will take another 18 months to 2 years before we get clarity on what that looks like. And then, of course, at the regulatory level, we've already seen a number of jurisdictions have already moved forward on nature-related reporting. Most notably in Europe with CSRD. TNFD and CSRD were working in parallel, and we were talking to each other as we developed TNFD and they developed CSRD. So we're already highly aligned with the CSRD requirements in Europe. Now those are going through a process of simplification, but the TNFD approach and the mindset that we've developed is already largely reflected in the CSRD. There's a very high level of consistency. As you know, Japan and Australia have just introduced new sustainability standards. Malaysia's made a lot of progress. India has a framework already which requires nature-related reporting. So this isn't new. What a lot of jurisdictions are doing is updating or upgrading their existing approach. Right? So the landscape is evolving and it's looking very familiar. So how has TNFD helped to participate in this process? We have already delivered and published our recommended disclosures, which is the green triangle at the top. So think of this as an iceberg. Right? So the bit sticking out of the water is the public disclosures. So we've already published our recommended disclosures. TCFD had 11 disclosures, we have 14, and I'm happy to take you through those. But underneath the surface, we've also provided a huge amount of guidance on how to do this, so assessment guidance. And that's proving to be incredibly popular around the world. The other triangle at the top is that we're now working on transition planning. So how to bring nature into transition planning. And of course, that would also be a public document alongside public disclosures. So our approach is science-based. It's led by the market. And obviously, regulators are looking at and considering our recommendations. But our job, like TCFD's, was to bring a market perspective to this and to lead, because we can't wait for the intergovernmental system to address these challenges. We all know the complexity of negotiations at COPs and the G20 and things like that. So TCFD was born out of a recognition that if governments can't lead at an international level and have a coordinated approach, the business and finance community would step forward and start getting the ball rolling. And so we are doing exactly the same thing. It's not to replace regulation, it's to inform future regulation. And we're now doing a lot of capacity building around these issues. So we recognize that people in business and finance have very small teams. They may have no existing knowledge on nature and biodiversity issues, and so there's a huge capacity building issue. So just this week in Singapore, we were training 60 people from across ASEAN, China and Japan, on how to train TNFD. So it was a train-the-trainer program. So my hope is that in the next 6 to 12 months, you'll start to see training offerings here in Malaysia and around ASEAN, so that we can start to see more companies and financial institutions getting the skills and education and training needs that they have. So essentially, we now have an integrated workflow. So if you're in your corporate context, we know where to start. We start with assessment. We end up publishing annual reports with nature-related disclosures and a transition plan. And we're working very hard on addressing these underlying challenges around data and capacity building, right? So the whole picture is there, and people are getting started. We've still got more work to do on some really complex questions like how to quantify risk, and we will be publishing additional sector guidance as well. We're about to start working on guidance around data centers and the technology sector. But we've already done agriculture, forestry, fishing, manufacturing, construction, real estate. So all of those sector guidance and the metrics are already online. And we do recommend metrics for reporting and for assessment. So we take an integrated approach. Our assessment approach is called the LEAP approach. Hopefully a number of you have had a look at that. We're finding it's working really well around the world. People are giving us very positive feedback. And that is the way people are getting started. With no assumed knowledge, doing a LEAP assessment starts to reveal what your potential nature-related issues might be. As I said, our guidance is very much aligned with ISSB and TCFD. It builds on TCFD and it's aligned with the approach the ISSB is taking. And we've also published a number of correspondence mappings to CSRD and GRI impact standards as well. So while people like to talk about the alphabet soup and it can seem very confusing, I can reassure you that we're all working together to try and streamline the reporting landscape. And at TNFD, our definition is we should disappear from the landscape in a couple of years' time, because our work will hopefully go into the ISSB standards. And if we're satisfied with what comes out of that process, like TCFD, we hope we can dissolve ourselves. So that will take some letters out of the alphabet soup. So here are the disclosures. You'll be very familiar with this from TCFD. I just wanted to highlight that we're already seeing companies publishing climate and nature disclosure reports, which is really exciting. I showed you the Norges Bank one on the investment side, but real-world companies, in this case a forestry company from Australia, are publishing integrated climate and nature disclosures, and then they're highlighting for the reader how this lines up with GRI or CDP or FRAG or the other different reporting requirements. It's not all about risk, and we can probably have a lengthy discussion around risk and compliance today and lots of technical questions, but TNFD is also about trying to catalyze information that can unlock financing for nature-related solutions. And as I said before, I think this is a transformational opportunity for business and finance. And there's no reason, as I said this week in Singapore, why this part of the world can't be pioneering and leading on the design of those real economy solutions and the financing solutions that are needed. And I was very struck by the CEO of Temasek's comments at the beginning of this week, where he said at a dinner reception with Bill Gates, he said that the issue now is not that there's a lack of ideas or a lack of projects. There's just a huge number of projects that are just under the threshold for being commercially viable. And his advice was we need to focus on those projects and make them cross the threshold for being commercially viable. So we've got some issues with who's going to take risk and maybe first loss provisions and things so we can make more projects viable. But the issue is not a lack of projects. It's about figuring out how we make them commercially viable so we can bring in the private capital that's needed. We're seeing a lot of interesting initiatives around the world. Some of you may have seen that Goldman Sachs has announced a $500 million biodiversity fund. We're seeing growing traction on debt for nature swaps amongst countries around the world. We're seeing interesting developments in the insurance sector. So I'm very excited about the emerging opportunity side and how do we create those solutions and take them to scale. But the big challenge we have at the moment is large institutional capital, pools of capital like pension funds. They're still sitting on the sideline because no one has figured out models that can bring in $300, $400, $500 million into this space. So that's the opportunity, and it's really just an innovation challenge for both companies and for financial institutions. So let me just close by giving you a sense of where we're up to with TNFD. So I mentioned that we published our recommendations in September 2023. So in the last 18 months, we've now got well over 500 adopters of the TNFD on a voluntary basis while they wait for those standards to be developed. I can tell you that number here of 502 was from November last year. We're now well over 550. So even despite all of the distractions and the other issues, companies are still signing up to adopt TNFD every week. So we're encouraged by the progress, and I'd say we're now closer to $20 trillion in assets under management. And you can see the enormous response from Asia. And I think that is a reflection that Asian economies are more dependent on nature than economies in other parts of the world. In Singapore, Malaysia, etc., I think it's around 60-65% moderate to high level dependence, or 60 to 65% of GDP is moderately to highly dependent on nature. Right? In some other countries, it's 40-45%. So I'll just close by pointing out that in this part of the world, you have more to lose through inaction and more to gain by being leaders because of the extent of your dependency. So my hope is we can see a lot of innovation coming out of this part of the world, and I look forward to hearing your ideas and your feedback today. So we are trying to do what we can to address the barriers to more action on the data side, on the capacity building side, but I think this is a tremendous opportunity for Malaysia to step forward and to help lead in the design of these solutions. So I'll stop there. I hope that's helpful framing for the discussion I'm about to have. So thank you.
Testing. Testing.
Thank you very much, Tony. That was extremely informative and very dense in terms of bringing us up to speed on how the TNFD is actually finding its place in this ecosystem of disclosure and transparency. We're happy to open the floor. We have until 10 after 10 the use of these facilities, so I highly recommend that you take the floor and ask all the questions that you need to ask. Do we have a microphone that is circulating around the floor? Yeah, so we have a couple of microphones there. So just do identify yourself and ask your question. I just don't want to direct it to except Tony. Yes. We take questions. Please, Serena. Over here, please. Yeah. And if you raise your hand, we'll get you a microphone early so we can save time too. Maybe we'll pick up a few questions if there are any and take them in groups. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. Serena Ismail from IOI Corporation. I'm in sustainability. Okay, so IOI is a agricultural-based company. So nature is very much intrinsic. Intrinsically important to us. It is our existence, so we have started on nature, on looking after our conservation areas, our soil biodiversity, our ecosystem. We have developed guidelines on biodiversity, and we are early adopters of the TCFDs. In fact, we are fully aligned now. So I'm giving you the background because to stress to you that I'm very, very open to the frameworks that have been presented. IOI is very much in the forefront of all this. The things that we were looking into, for example, is SBTN, because SBTN is very much, in fact, our biodiversity guideline is very much in alignment with SBTN. So we made sure that any gaps that we have in our guidelines, when we revised it in 2023, it is very much in line with SBTN. I think my main question or clarification that I require from TNFD is the fact that it has a financial disclosure aspects. And in order for the financial disclosure aspects to be correct, you need to make sure that the parameters of measurement is also correct, that there is no possibility of greenwashing. We are very much under the spotlight of NGOs. Our stakeholders are extremely critical because I am from the oil palm plantation. This is like the devil in any agriculture. Forget soybean. Soybean is like the saint, supposedly, compared to palm. So what I'm trying to say is that we are very careful about this. And when you look at S1 and S2 as well, we are also being informed that there is an element in which if we report or disclose, and if that disclosure is incorrect, we can be sued in liability. And so there is also that impact. So financial disclosure is the issue that I have right now. Not about disclosing our targets, our metrics, our initiatives to address nature. Climate was very clear. You have one parameter, greenhouse gas emission. Nobody can play around. There's no real experts in biodiversity. There's soil biodiversity, there's insect biodiversity, so many numerous. The issue arising from all this is where greenwashing. And this is where I'm very, very wary, because the financial institution has got, I'm so sorry to say, you guys have very little knowledge about nature. All you can look is at the money part, the accounting part. So I'm not being very diplomatic in this, but I need to have full clarification. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Serena. Any other questions, or is that one me? Oh, there's a question over there. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Hi, I'm TJ. I'm from Sunway University. I'm working on research for the green transition for businesses, particularly with SMEs. And my question is more of the incentives of business leaders that want to adopt or make these disclosures, because in my experience, a lot of it is driven by compliance. But I'm really interested in whether you have any experience with business leaders who genuinely care about the impact of their business activities, particularly related to nature, kind of why they cared about it, and if you have any stories of what motivated them to do so that these kinds of reporting is driven more than just compliance, but a genuine desire to care about the environment and our interactions with nature.
Okay, can we handle those two first?
Sure. So, thank you for both of the questions. So, you're absolutely right that greenwashing is a big concern globally right now. And what we've done at TNFD, while we're market-led, we're also science-based. And over the last 3 years in developing our recommendations, we've spent an enormous number of hours working with the world's best scientific experts to develop a metrics architecture for what should be measured and then reported. So if I go back to, the slides here. No, I was going to bring up, there they are, okay. So if I just take you to here, TCFD was focused on risks and opportunities, right? So financial risks and financial opportunities to the organization. So we do that as well. But because we live in a world now with different approaches to materiality, single and double, Europe has already mandated double materiality, we also had to, from a disclosure perspective, look at impacts and dependencies on nature. Now, the word dependencies is largely invisible in the climate discussion. We don't talk about our dependence on the atmosphere, right? So at TNFD, we do two things. We encourage people to think about what you have to assess and what you have to disclose. We think it's fundamental that even if you're doing single materiality, so ISSB compliant reporting on just financial materiality, you still have to understand your impacts and dependencies on nature, because dependencies is the pathway to risk. But also impacts can create risks. So for example, if you're polluting a river, you're a textile company, you're polluting a river, or you're a fishing company, you're polluting a river, that pollution impact can lead to litigation risk, right, which is a transition risk. So what we've done over the last 3 years is we've figured out the metrics for measuring dependencies on nature and impacts on nature. And to your point, there's thousands of things that the scientists measure about the state of nature. We have worked with them over 3 years to boil that right down into 9 core metrics. So 9 plus CO2e for climate, so you have 10 metrics for climate and nature. Now that's not everything, but we think, and we've recommended, and it's in our report that was published in September 2023, we think that it's important that every business that's disclosing should disclose on those 10 metrics on a comply or explain basis. So that's 9 other aspects of nature plus your CO2 emissions on climate, which came from TCFD. On top of that, we've then looked at additional metrics by sector, and that's all in our sector guidance. We tried to keep those additional metrics to a minimum. We didn't want it to become 50 or 100 metrics. So on average, for most additional sectors, there's an additional 5 to 10 metrics, right? So, but to your point about greenwashing, we've done everything we can to work with the scientists to make sure that they have informed and signed off on and approved or support the TNFD's metrics. So that is all designed to mitigate that risk, that we're not encouraging people to report things which then sets them up for criticism by civil society and the scientific community and other things. So, of course, all we can do is recommend. We can't legislate, right? So that lives in the world of governments. But we feel like after 3 years of work on the metrics and what should be disclosed, that we've come up with a really robust set of metrics that's both practical and science-based. And we've got the support of the scientific community. And our process was very open. We had civil society groups writing to us saying, you've forgotten about this, or you need to do that, or what about this? And we took all of that feedback on board. I'd also, to your second point about disclosure and risk of litigation, we did a webinar middle of last year with a group of lawyers and board directors, and it's called Nature and Boards. And I'd encourage you to go to our website and search it. And it was a fascinating discussion. And one of the central messages that came through is you can also be equally liable if you don't disclose something that's material. Obviously, that's the core essence of fiduciary responsibility for board directors. So, you know, and this came through from some of the lawyers on the webinar, and they're saying there's a bit of a sense of some people that will just do climate, we'll just ignore the rest for now until legislation comes. But the bottom line is, if it's material, you have a responsibility to disclose it. TNFD actually helps you do that, aligned with S1 and in a way that helps to meet the fiduciary responsibilities of the boards. And on Monday of this week, we released a new document called Asking Better Questions on Nature for Board Directors. We did that at the Singapore Stock Exchange with the Institute of Directors in Singapore. So for anyone who's sitting on a board or anyone who has to report to a board, I would encourage you to have a look at it. We've had an amazing response in the last 3 days online. And we've identified 12 key questions that boards should ask themselves and try and satisfy in order to make sure that they're giving appropriate attention to these nature-related issues. And that, of course, is there to help them frame up what do we need to know as a board that the company is doing all the things that it should be doing, and what would be appropriate for us to disclose to external investors and stakeholders in accordance with corporate reporting requirements. So these are very difficult, delicate issues, but then the momentum for disclosing more than just climate is not going away. And what we've got to provide people with practical guidance to get started to do this in the most appropriate way with metrics that are backed by the science. On the second question, so it's a really interesting point, and I think there's plenty of evidence that there are corporate executives around the world who deeply care about the state of the planet. One obvious example is all of the companies that have elected to become B corporations, right? So I'm sure you're familiar with the B Corp movement. So it's voluntary. So obviously companies who have a particular vision or set of values have elected to put themselves and account for themselves at a higher standard. And so I think that's an obvious example of company executives who say, well, we want to make money. We're in the business of making money, but we want to do it in a way where it's sustainable in sync with the state of the planet. So the B Corp movement is a great example. And then, of course, there are a few standout corporate leaders who I think have exemplified this. One is Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever, who has been a real pioneer on sustainability issues. In fact, he just made a post yesterday on our director's guidance, which was very nice. But there are others across other businesses. Another one is some of the adventure clothing brands have been real leaders in sort of sustainability, Timberland, people like that. So just some examples.
A follow-up maybe? No?
I have a follow-up.
Yeah.
Sorry. If somebody else wants to ask, they can go ahead.
No,
I can call you.
Yeah.
If not, I will just ask.
Perhaps if you'll just hold for a little while, we get some questions in before, yeah. Yes, so we've got two already, so we'll go back to you.
Good morning, Tony. Very insightful presentation. Gandhi Subaya from Mindshift Consulting. I'm glad that you brought up about the commercial viability aspect, because a couple of weeks ago, speaking to some investors in the UK, this is exactly what they said, that we're not going to invest anything, either TNFD or TCFD, unless it's commercially viable. And what's glaring, though, is that there's a lot of small businesses, SMEs, who have products but aren't able to scale at this moment in time. But commercial viability, because of the lack of understanding of how to make it commercially, there's no one guiding them to help them to get to that level. Now, so investors don't have the patience. Exploitative nature of investors means that if it doesn't have the right returns fast enough, they don't want to invest. So there's a missed opportunity with all these sort of small businesses out there, and lack of direction for them to, look at how to look at and who to look at for opportunities. How does TNFD and TCFD probably provide that sort of guidance for these companies to come to a platform potentially to and find the right investors.
Hi, my name is Daniel from D-Blocks Malaysia. So just a little bit of background of D-Blocks Malaysia. So we currently developing a game in Roblox, right? So we do have some question regarding the greenwashing, because currently some people use the term of green a lot, or something green product and all, but actually it is the same product. They just wrap it with a new paper, right? So what's your opinion about how you can deliver the message of what we want to try to want to the public, right? About the green. What is the actual green about? What is it, what is not, right? So do you think it is good if we try to approach to the school, or the younger generation, about the green, and about the sustainability itself? Probably, like for us, we do use Roblox to explain to the kids about what is SDG. Like SDG 1, what is it about? SDG 2, what is it about? So do you think it is a good approach, probably can be used from any other companies to deliver the message? And yeah, that's it.
Very good. So on the first question, obviously TNFD is not established to promote investment opportunities, but we are thinking about how can we help to unlock this problem of financing new solutions. As we've seen with the energy transition, right? We're seeing the world knows what we need to do on the energy side and decarbonisation, and now we're seeing a huge focus on unlocking finance for decarbonisation and adaptation finance. We're trying to think about what can we contribute on the nature side, right? And so the global goal, as I mentioned, is the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was agreed in Montreal 2 years ago. So we have the goals. It's often summarized or simplified as nature positive. So nature positive is now the version of net zero, right? So how do we unlock financing to get to nature positive? At TNFD, we've done a few things. So you mentioned small companies. We're pioneering new products that maybe replace plastic for packaging, or something for new types of sustainable wood in the built environments. There's even things made out of mushrooms now, mycelium-based construction materials and things, right? So these are all incredibly exciting, but they're all very small, and they're struggling to get that scaling capital that's necessary. So there's a couple of things we're trying to do. In our metrics architecture, which I just described on dependencies and impacts, one of the things that I think is not well understood and is a huge missed opportunity is on climate. The whole global climate discussion is about what we don't want. We don't want emissions into the atmosphere, right? So we're all trying to hammer down the thing we don't want, get rid of the thing we don't want. We don't want emissions, right? So we're trying to lower negative impacts. So back to here, we're all very focused on CO2e, and it's a negative impact. And the whole agenda is about getting rid of what we don't want. On the nature side, we want to lower our negative impacts, but because of the regenerative capacity of nature, we have this incredible opportunity to help contribute to nature's recovery so business and finance can have a positive impact on the local natural ecosystem. It could be conservation. You know, you can buy up land and just let nature do its thing. That's a positive contribution by locking away land. But we don't always, it's not just about conservation. We have to broaden the mindset that taking action on nature is just conservation. Conservation is one strategy. Then there's the whole regeneration of agriculture and forestry and wetlands and other ecosystems, right? So what are the technologies and the products that could help to do that? So we've got in the TNFD, we've tried to develop the architecture. So we've got metrics for negative impacts, so measuring improvements in doing less bad, if I can simplify it that way. We've got to do less bad, like we've got to lower our emissions, we have to lower our water consumption, we have to lower deforestation rates. But we've also included in here positive impact metrics. And our hope is that so for example, returning water to nature. And I was just in a session in Singapore around data centers, and one of the world's big water utilities was saying that data center builders are now exploring ways to return the water from the cooling that's required for data centers. You cool it and you clean the water and you put it back into the natural environment, right? So if it meets certain standards, it's good enough to go back into the river or back into nature. So if we can measure that, right? So the negative metric would be how much water are you using for your cooling of your data center. The positive metric is how much water are you returning to nature. And we think if we can get people to report on the positive impacts, we can then create incentives for financing businesses that are having really good positive impacts, right? So let's take another example. You're farming seaweed. We know seaweed can be used in food, it can be used in packaging. So if you were a seaweed farming business, your positive impact metrics would probably be fantastic, right? Because you're sequestering carbon in the seaweed, you're contributing to fish stock regrowth. There's so many benefits of something like seaweed or mangroves. If those things start to appear in financial reports as positive impacts, then investors can see that and go, wow, look at this business over here. It makes money and it's having a positive impact on nature. That's something that we want to finance, right? So first thing we're trying to do is address the incentives through the provision of data. Because at the moment, no one's reporting on positive impacts. It's all about negative impacts. So that's a really big opportunity. The second thing that we're starting to see is the big gap is this scaling finance, right? So if you think about another technology like precision fermentation, starting to get a lot of attention. So this is like the way you make beer or something, there's a fermentation process. They're now using the same technology to develop bio-based materials. And this is a very exciting new technology that people think have got a lot of promise. But you needed like $70 to $100 million to build your first production facility. So people have got the 20 million from VC or PE to build a pilot plant, but once they've proven it up, they can't get the 70 to 100 million to do the production facility. So we're now starting to see some private equity companies that are trying to move into that space and figure out the financing model so that they can be providing that scaling finance to get these innovators across the valley of death and out of pilot testing and into scalable production. It's not easy. I'm not suggesting it's widely solved, but I think that is a huge opportunity. So I think you're exactly right, and it's just a financing, innovation, and structuring challenge that is there as an opportunity. I don't know if that's helpful to your question. On the greenwashing question, so we don't deal with product disclosures, right? So that's a whole separate question. So, and I'm not an expert in product disclosures, but clearly everyone is worried about being misled by the labeling on packaging, right? We're told that this is a healthy product, but we don't really know. We're told that this material is safe to put in your house, but people are skeptical of the labeling, right? So we have a public trust and confidence issue in product level disclosures. I think we have to get better at that, and ultimately that's a regulatory issue, and governments have to look at the integrity of those systems and decide whether they want to regulate to make them more robust. On the investment side, some of you will be familiar in Europe, the European Green Taxonomy is designed to make it clearer about investment products and which ones are really very green or just a little bit green or not green at all. So we're seeing some of that change on the financial product side, particularly coming out of Europe. Just on this point, I think it's worth highlighting one particular issue. So there's increasing attractiveness in using this term nature positive. And I just wanted to give you a sense about where the conversation's going on this globally. We're starting to see companies saying, oh, we're a nature positive company, or our product is this is a nature positive glass, right? So it's very seductive to use these terms in a marketing sense to try and sell more product. But of course, then the risk is someone's going to hold you to account that this glass is actually not very nature positive, and then everybody wants to run in the opposite direction and not use the term nature positive ever again. So globally, we're trying to address this concern, and the focus is not on trying to be nature positive. It's not about trying to be a nature positive company. It's about how your company is contributing to nature positive outcomes for society. So for all of you who are looking at this and maybe having conversations internally about what does this nature positive thing mean and how do we use this term responsibly, I would encourage you to think about it in terms of defining your contributions to the societal goal of a nature positive Malaysia, rather than is my company nature positive or is our product nature positive. So it's a really important difference. And to the concern about greenwashing, I think it's both more responsible to take that approach, and it's going to minimize your risk of exposure in the future to criticism that you're making claims about your products that you can't substantiate.
Thanks, Tony. I think we can come back. Yeah. Let's come back to Serena first, and perhaps Dr. Hesri. Anyone else there? Okay, just a second. So. Okay, because we've got 3 on this side, and then plus 2 on the other side, and we're really on a time crunch, so get to the question.
I'll keep my answers shorter.
Yeah, short questions, short answers. 10 seconds.
Hi, Tony. David Tay. Not representing anyone, but I do work in sustainability ESG. My question is actually around financial institutions. So like talking to banks in Malaysia, we have this CCPD, climate change, principle-based taxonomy, where banks are actually required to do assessment on their clients or in the portfolio. So they're actually looking at climate adaptation and mitigations. Now, because you talk about nature-based, right? Some of these banks, of course, if they're looking at to do this assessment in Malaysia context, yes, but they have institutional investor outside Malaysia that actually ask them to look at nature already. And they sort of see that, well, my regulation or my jurisdiction in locally has not really asked us about this. Now the question is how they actually can do both climate and nature-based together, because I know S3 is actually under development, the BEES. Maybe you can share something that you might have, through your work in Europe. Thanks.
Who has the other mic? Who has the other mic? Oh, okay. Perhaps you can pass, yeah. And then if you could pass it over to Dr. Hesri. Yeah, thanks. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Sorry, I was showing the mic. Hesri.
Wait. Behind us, 10 seconds.
Sorry.
Maybe Dr. Hesri first while we sort out that problem.
Thank you, Dr. Gary. Just a quick one. 550 adopters is pretty encouraging. Any sort of wisdom or insights from this? Are they creating business value in terms of better access to capital or better risk management? If you can share some insights.
Okay, maybe those 2 questions first.
Great. I can be really quick. For the banks and due diligence, so your observation is exactly right. We're all part of a global economy. Capital is global. Foreign investors are going to ask you questions that maybe domestic capital providers are not asking, right? And you have to satisfy those requirements. So I would encourage Malaysian banks in that situation to start using our TNFD guidance. We have the metrics, we have the guidance, we have the questions to ask. So there's a huge reservoir of material that we provide that can help banks answer those questions. And on the adopters, we know not only do we have 550 adopters, there's already over 125 first-generation TNFD reports that have already been published. There's about 60, 70 of them on our website. And we're now, this week we issued a survey to start a review of market practice. We'll be publishing that in September as our first annual status report. So hold on for that. In September, we'll have a lot more insights to offer you about what's happening.
Okay, great.
Hi, Tony, great insights. My question is really short, but I was keen to hear from your experience and your knowledge, like what is specific roles that regulators can play in a country like Malaysia, which is mega diverse.
May we know your affiliation?
Oh, I'm from the SC.
Okay. Material information.
So we've got a cluster here.
Yeah.
I have a question on disclosure, the cost of disclosure, right? As they are now, even on climate, right? The cost of disclosure can be very expensive for SMEs, for instance, right? Or not? And to add on to nature-based disclosure, right? How do we go about addressing this? What are the kind of interventions needed?
Okay. And another one on that side.
Hello, my name is Marani Bamramli from Gibbon Conservation Society.
Gibbon. Yeah.
We wrote down already our question, so it will be fast. So, but also before I get to our question, it's important that I contextualize our work. At Gibbon Conservation Society, we work at the intersection of community resilience and ecosystem recovery, where the most meaningful outcomes, like the return of endangered gibbons, family that are victims of illegal wildlife trade and deforestation, and or an indigenous family earning sustainable income through forest-friendly livelihood that don't always show up in conventional metrics. We also know the pressure of chasing funding that requires us to force-feed our impact into narrow quantitative indicators that often miss the heart of our work. We are talking about 12 years experience. Funders often ask us to report things like the number of trees planted without considering whether those trees survive or actually restored biodiversity in the area. We are asked to count how many people attended awareness programs, even though one deep transformative session with local indigenous youth often means more than reaching thousands with surface level information. Reporting on the numbers of gibbons we rescued or community trainings conducted doesn't reflect whether those gibbons individuals have progressed in their rehabilitation journey or if local communities actually feel empowered. Similarly, one metric you mentioned earlier is the volume of water returned to nature after cooling data centers. And please correct me if I'm wrong here. Measured in liters, it looks impressive. I am curious if also measures whether indigenous or local communities who rely on that water were consulted, or whether the return of water helped heal ecological relationship disrupted by extraction in the first place. Metrics like percentage decrease in deforestation may look good on paper but often ignore the seasonal, political, or relational context behind that drop. Even indicators like increased household income or the number of indigenous people employed fail to show whether these efforts are truly just, sustainable, or led by the communities themselves. These numbers alone rarely capture the deeper impact we see daily. This is from the field. Like the return of endangered Malaysian gibbons back to the wild, the resilience of indigenous knowledge system, or a woman from the indigenous Semai community learning citizen science as part of her skill role as one of our wildlife rangers. So I'd like to ask, why has Malaysia not yet adopted more nuanced and context-aware quantitative and qualitative metrics for nature-related disclosures, and how does the TNFD framework accounts for these local realities when it comes to decision-making and investment flows? The second one, more specifically, how are funders and corporations using TNFD adjusting their expectations so that results also reflect intergenerational impact, cultural connection to land, and true ecosystem regeneration, not just financial performance or short-term mitigation? Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for.
Great. Do you want me to give quick responses?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you for those two questions. I think on the role of regulators, that's for you to decide. Just to be clear, we don't advocate or lobby for mandatory adoption of TNFD. That's not our role. Other people are doing that because they've seen the quality of our work and they think it's important. We do go in and educate regulators when they ask to be briefed on our work, and we do that extensively around the world. But how this plays out and how it makes its way down this cascade, that's up to standards bodies and regulators. On the cost of disclosure, again, in our survey that we issued this week, we're asking people how much it's costing to do their first generation TNFD reports. We're looking forward to finding out that information as you are, and that will be in our annual status report document we published in September. there's a huge range of numbers being thrown around. Some people are saying it actually didn't cost them very much at all, and other people are saying that it, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, and there's also speculation about how much it cost to do CSRD reporting last year in Europe. So I don't have a lot of confidence in the numbers. So we're going to ask in a survey, and then we'll get a much better read on that. Thank you for your question about Indigenous community engagement. I just want to bring you back to here very, very quickly. You raised a number of really important issues which are sort of beyond the scope of TNFD as a nature disclosure framework, but there's now another initiative on the social aspects. So we've gone from climate to nature and now social. It's called the Taskforce on Inequality and Social-Related Financial Disclosures. They are just getting started, and so we have been in touch with them, and they're leveraging our work. But what we did do is here, under Governance C, we introduced a new disclosure. This was not in TCFD, and the Governance C disclosure is to ask companies to disclose have you engaged with Indigenous peoples, local communities and affected stakeholders? And have you done so in compliance with the OECD General Principles for Responsible Business, which is the foundation with the UN conventions? So we have gone into this area. We do ask companies to describe and explain whether they have done that. And obviously by asking whether they've done it, for investors, if they don't answer this question, then investors can say, well, what's your position on engagement with local communities? What are you doing? Is it in compliance with the UN conventions and the OECD Responsible Business Guidelines? So it is in there, but we haven't answered all of the questions that you posed, but I think the other task force will start to address some of those issues.
Thank you very much, Tony. And please, we are out of time, so we do have to leave this room and surrender it back. I think Securities Commission wants it for something else. But please feel free to catch up with Tony outside. I think we still have the coffee, right? So let's do that. I do have some housekeeping that I need to do. First of all, the session is recorded. It is available on Climate Governance Malaysia's YouTube channel. There is time-tagged content. We do thank you all for joining us today and for your questions. Please do continue to fill in that feedback questionnaire because we really value your input. Just to plug a little bit, our upcoming conversation series is going to feature Mr. Mark Mills, founder of Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, or the AIGCC, and co-founder of Generation Investment Management, alongside former US Vice President Al Gore. We do hope that you stay engaged with CGM through our newsletter. All the QR codes for registering are on the website. Also find out about our Friends of CGM program in terms of corporates. We do already see that's perhaps even the environmental tab in the SEDG, the Simplified ESG Disclosure Guide, only covers emissions, energy, water, waste, and materials. It does not yet cover any nature aspects. And so we can fully expect perhaps that even Capital Markets Malaysia might do something to amend the SEDG, the SEDG, to include these things in the future. And once again, in Malaysia, we are thinking about beyond compliance. All right, so even though the regulations might not be there, as a corporate entity, it behooves you to jump ahead. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I was telling state governments, your scope 1 is negative. They didn't understand. As forest managers, as forest reserve managers, their scope 1 is negative. And the moment they realize that, then perhaps we can begin to think of beyond compliance in a more integrated manner, rather than looking at buckets and buckets and buckets and buckets within buckets. But thank you very much for joining us. We do look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you so much, Tony. Big hand for Tony, please.
Hello.